Shalom, I am Babsi, and today I will be reading from the second book of Samuel, chapter 4 through chapter 7 from the Tree of Life version. Now when Saul's son heard that Abner had died in Hebron, his courage sank, and all the Israelites were disturbed. Saul's son had two men who were commanders of raiding bands. The name of one was Banah, and the name of the other Rechab, sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite of the sons of Benjamin. For Beeroth is also considered part of Benjamin, though the Beerothites had fled to Gittaim and live there as outsiders to this day. Saul's son Jonathan had a son whose legs were crippled. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse picked him up and fled. It came about, as she was hurrying to flee, that he fell and was crippled. His name was Mephibosheth. Now the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Banah set out and came to the house of Ish-bosheth at the heat of the day, as he was taking his midday nap. When they came within the house, as though to get wheat, they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Banah escaped. When they had gotten within the house, he was lying on his bed in his bedroom. They stabbed him and killed him, then beheaded him and took his head, and traveled by the way of the Arabah all night. Then they brought the head of Ish-bosheth to David in Hebron, and said to the king, "Here is the head of Saul's son Ish-bosheth, your enemy, who sought your life. Today Adonai has avenged my lord the king of Saul and his offspring." Then David answered Rechab and his brother Banah, sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, saying to them, "As Adonai lives, who redeemed my soul out of all distress, when someone informed me, saying, 'Look, Saul is dead,' thinking he was a bearer of good news, I seized him and killed him in Ziklag instead of rewarding him for his news. How much more, when the wicked man have killed a righteous person in his own house and on his bed, should I not now require his blood from your hands and rid the earth of you?" Then David commanded the young men, and they slew them, cut off their hands and their legs, and hung them up beside the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ish-bosheth and buried it in the grave of Abner in Hebron. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, "Here we are, your own flesh and blood. Even before, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led Israel out and back. Also Adonai said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel.'" So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David cut a covenant with them at Hebron before Adonai. Then they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. Now the king and his soldiers marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the region. But they said to David, "You will never get in here. Even the blind and the lame could ward you off," thinking, "David can't get in here." Nevertheless, David did capture the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. On that day David said, "Whoever would conquer the Jebusites must strike through the water shaft to those lame and blind, whom David's soul despises." This is why they used to say, "The blind or lame couldn't get into the house." So David occupied the stronghold and renamed it the City of David. Then David fortified it all around from the Millo inward. David continued to grow stronger, for Adonai Elohim Tzevaot was with him. Then King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys to David with cedar logs, carpenters and masons, and they built a palace for David. David then realized that Adonai had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Then David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem, after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. Now these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Eber, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. Now when the Philistines heard that David was anointed king over Israel, all of Philistine marched up, searching for David. When David heard about it, he went down to the strongholds. The Philistines came and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. Then David inquired of Adonai, saying, Should I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them over into my hand? Adonai answered David, Go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines over into your hand. So David came to Baal Perazim, and David struck them down there. So he said, Adonai has broken through my enemies before me, like the breakthrough of waters. That is why he named that place Baal Perazim. They abandoned their idols there, so David and his men removed them. But the Philistine marched up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim again. When David inquired of Adonai, he said, Do not go up. Instead, circle around behind them and attack them in front of the balsam trees. Now it will be, when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then you must act, for when Adonai will have gone out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines. David did just as Adonai had commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines from Geba as far as Gezer. Now David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. Then David and all the people who were with him arose and set out from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name, the very name of Adonai Tzevaot, who is enthroned between the cherubim. So they loaded the ark of God on a new cart and carried it out of the house of Abinadab that was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, Abinadab's sons, drove the new cart as they brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, with the ark of God, and Ahio was walking in front of the ark. Meanwhile, David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating before Adonai with all kinds of instruments made of cypress wood, with harps, lyres, tambourines, 3-stringed instruments, and cymbals. But when they reached the threshing floor to Nachon, Uzzah reached out to the ark of God and grasped it, for the oxen had stumbled. Then the anger of Adonai was kindled against Uzzah. God struck him down there for his irreverence, so that he died there beside the ark of God. David was upset because of Adonai's outburst against Uzzah. That place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So David was frightened of Adonai that day. Then he said, How can the ark of Adonai come to me? David was unwilling to move the ark of Adonai to him, to the city of David. Instead, David diverted it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. So the ark of Adonai remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. Meanwhile, Adonai blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. Then it was reported to King David, saying, Adonai has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him, because of the ark of God. So David went and brought the ark of God up from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with joy. Now when the bearers of the ark of Adonai had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. Meanwhile, David was dancing before Adonai with all his might while he was wearing a linen ephod. So David and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of Adonai with shouting and with the sound of the shofar. But as the ark of Adonai entered the city of David, Saul's daughter Michal looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before Adonai. So she despised him in her heart. They brought in the ark of Adonai and set it in its place, in the midst of the tent that David had pitched for it. Then David offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before Adonai. When David had finished offering the burnt offering and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of Adonai Tsevaot. Then he distributed to all the people, to the whole multitude of Israel, men and women alike, to every one a loaf of bread, a cake made in a pan, and a raisin cake. Then all the people departed, each to his home. David returned to bless his own household, but Saul's daughter Michal came out to meet David and said, How the king of Israel distinguished himself today, when he uncovered himself today in the eyes of the slave girls of his subjects, as any vulgar fellow would shamelessly uncover himself. It was before Adonai, David said to Michal, who chose me instead of your father and all his household, appointing me ruler over the people of Adonai, over Israel. So I danced before Adonai, and will dishonor myself even more than this, and will be low in my own eyes. Yet in the eyes of the slave girls whom you mentioned, I will be honored. So Saul's daughter Michal had no children to the day of her death. Now it came about, when the king lived in his palace, and Adonai had granted him rest from all his enemies around him, that the king said to the prophet Nathan, See now, I am living in a house of cedar, yet the ark of God remains within curtains. Go, do all that is in your heart, Nathan said to the king, for Adonai is with you. But it came to pass the same night that the word of Adonai came to Nathan, saying, Go, tell my servant David, thus says Adonai, Are you to build me a house for me to dwell in? Since the day that I brought up the children of Israel from Egypt to this day, I have not dwelt in a house, but have been moving about in a tent, even in a tabernacle. In all my journeying among all the children of Israel, did I ever speak a word to any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedar? So now, thus you shall say to my servant David, Thus says Adonai Tsevaot, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be a ruler over my people, over Israel. I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make your name as great as the greatest on earth. I will also set up a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so they may dwell in their own place and not be disturbed again. Nor will the children of wickedness afflict them any more, as in the past, since the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel. So I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, Adonai declares to you that Adonai will make a house for you. When your days are done and you sleep with your fathers, I will raise up your seed, who will come forth from you after you, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish his royal throne forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. If he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of man, and with the strokes from sons of men. Yet my loving kindness will not be withdrawn from him, as I withdrew it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. So your house and your kingship will be secure forever before you. Your throne will be established forever. Just so Nathan spoke all these words and all this vision to David. Then King David went in and sat before Adonai and said, Who am I, my Lord Adonai, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far? Yet this was a small thing in your eyes, my Lord Adonai, for you have spoken also of your servant's house for the distant future. This is a revelation for humanity, my Lord Adonai. What more can David add in speaking to you? For you already know your servant, my Lord Adonai. For the sake of your word and according to your own heart, you have done everything great, revealing this to your servant. Therefore you are great, my Lord Adonai, for there is none like you, and there is no other God besides you, as we all have heard with our ears. What one nation on earth is like your people, like Israel, whom God went to redeem for himself as a people, to make for himself a name, to do for you a great thing and awesome deeds for your land before your people, whom you redeemed for yourself from Egypt, driving out nations and their gods. So you establish for yourself your people Israel as your very own people forever, and you, Adonai, have become their God. So now, my Lord Adonai, confirm the word that you have spoken concerning your servant and his house forever, and do as you have promised. Let your name be magnified forever, by saying, Adonai Tzevaot is God over Israel. May the house of your servant David be established before you. For you, Adonai Tzevaot, God of Israel, have made a revelation to your servant, saying, I will build you a house. Therefore, your servant has found his heart to pray this prayer to you. So now, my Lord Adonai, you alone are God, and your words are truth, and you have promised your servant this good thing. So now let it please you to bless the house of your servant, to continue forever before you. For you, my Lord Adonai, have spoken, and with your blessing your servant's house will be blessed forever. Amen.